Okay, well, welcome everybody to the next edition of the LAPOP WISM. Today we're excited to have Carmen Le Foulon from CEP Chile. And she's going to be talking about mode effects, so within subject exploration. So Carmen, I'll hand it over to you. As always, we're going to do about 30 minutes of presentation, 30 minutes of Q&A. Feel free to use the chat if you have any questions, or you can raise your hand with Zoom and we'll answer those in the Q&A. So go ahead.
First of all, many thanks for inviting me to the workshop and to everyone that's here. This is a joint project that we have conducted at CEP, which is a research center that conducts a survey, and Datavoz, which I think people from LAPOP may know them for they field their survey in Chile. I work with Ariana Choaki and Benjamín Oteiza, who are from Centro de Estudios Politicos, and Paulina Valenzuela and Joao Charan, who are from Datavoz. Regarding mode effects, there's a rich and growing literature. I just added some of the papers that have been involved, and it's ever growing. Usually they focus on interviewer versus non-interviewer differences between modes, the self-administers, and you can have effects on social desirability, but also they see item non-response, non-differentiation, regarding, for example, a greater social desirability bias on interviewers respect with non-interviewers, but on the other hand, interviewers may be able to get a lesser item non-response than non-interviewers. And there's also the cognitive process that are different, especially between oral, which is auditory questions only, and visual, in which people are presented either a card when it's face-to-face, or by definition on a paper or a web survey, people actually see the questions. So those are the main differences among them. There is stronger evidence for social desirability bias that we found, but also on the oral and visual. And as always, it seems that it depends on the type of question, the surveys. And so the motivation for this, and just to give a bit of context, as I mentioned, I'm from Centro de Estudios Politicos. We conduct a complex survey nationally represented. We have a long series, so it's very important. The comparability between, if we ever move to the comparability, we have national samples since 1994, and we also have the ISSP model since 1998. And it's a complex survey design, stratified by region and urban-rural, and we have 3 stages random sampling from the block, household, and individual. And Datavoz works with us in the sampling process. It's an applied social research, public opinion, and market research company. And they work with us with the elaboration of methodological designs and the supervision. But as you all know, and since the pandemic has made extremely evident, there's increased challenges to face-to-face surveys in terms of accessing the people, also in context of increasing threats of public order or fears of security. People are less likely to open their doors. You have more closed streets or more closed buildings, which is difficult to access. So we have a coverage difference. But also the modes have also differences and also challenges. So the challenges differ between mode. So what are we trying to answer with this design or with this research is first, what are the differences in coverage of different modes? And this is applied research to our context, this is Chile, a Latin American country. But also within the same group, even if we could control for composition differences for coverage, well, are answers comparable across modes? So what are the modes effects? So in order to answer these questions, we have a research design in which we, let me see if I can highlight. Let me highlight, yeah. So we have our face-to-face survey, which is the nationally representative survey. And at the same time, we conducted a telephone survey done by RDD. So it's at least the state of the art of nationally representative samples in Chile. We don't have other methods that are current in the US. And in both surveys that were fielded at the same time, we asked them the willingness to be surveyed again, and we have at the end of the survey. So we have a bit, about 60% decided are willing to be surveyed again in the face-to-face, and almost 90% on the telephone accepted to be surveyed again. And then we contacted those that wanted to be accepted to be recontacted, and we had a lower response rate. So among those that accept to be recontacted, which is 54% in the face-to-face, 30% we were able to recontact, which means like it's only 16% of the original sample of individuals from the face-to-face. And the numbers are 90% for the telephone survey, which is this one, and 90% accepts to be recontacted. But among those, the response rate of this subsample is even lower, 50%. And as a last notion, we have a response rate for the face-to-face, which is 78%. And from the RDD, we had a response rate of 16%. So we had these two national representative surveys, one done as we usually do it face-to-face, and another for the study purpose on RDD, and we did a follow-up. For the face-to-face, we did a resurvey by the telephone, and for the telephone survey, we did a resurvey by online. Sorry. And now I have to withdraw this. Sorry. So what is our design strategy? Let me erase this. So we have our empirical strategies first to compare within subjects, so the same respondents, face-to-face versus telephone, so a CAPI questionnaire versus a CATI, computer-assisted personal interview versus computer-assisted telephone interview. And then for the telephone to an online, CATI versus CAWI. For the online survey, we sent emails to the persons, and the people answered the questions by Qualtrics. They were the online questionnaire was evaluated, could be conducted by either the computer or the cell phone. And as you probably know, most people answer, at least in Chile, which we have a large coverage of internet and smart telephones by their telephones. We also want to explore the differences and the quality, the difference between modes, between face-to-face versus the telephone survey, the two national representative samples, which with the usual done. And also we are going in a different paper to explore the coverage differences between modes. So the difference in coverage between the face-to-face and the RDD telephone survey. So between two survey designs that aim to cover the same population, one face-to-face, a complex survey design, and the other RDD, what is the difference in coverage, and also to better understand attrition between contact and recontact mode, which are not going to be presented today. So today I'm going to focus within subject and basically the mode difference between them. So what are we going to look now? We're going to look at and this is, I've seen that Alexander Senat is going to present the next seminar. This is following most of his research, so and many others as well. So we're going to look to data quality indicators, item non-response, non-differentiation, which is straight lining, primacy and recency effects, in which you expect different effects between visual interviews and non-visual. And then we're going to explore measurement equivalence, but also we're going to look at results, looking at within subject differences. So within the same population that answered the contact and the recontact sample, we're going to look first aggregate results, whether the aggregates result, the conclusions would be different using different mode, but also how the within subject change between modes, how people change the answers between modes. And we're going to further explore that change, decomposing it in different categories that I will explain later. So an additional consideration, well, recontacted groups differ from the original sample. They are usually more educated, they are less and more identified with the left. We may have panel effects in the sense that we conducted a follow-up questionnaire with the median time between the original survey and the recontact survey was 19 days. People may remember the questions, there'll be some learning, maybe some fatigue while they're asking me this again. We try to address those by doing a shorter follow-up questionnaire, which then we have, we include core questions in both, and we have some new questions in the follow-up, so people, those that have memories did not perceive that they were doing exactly the same survey over and over, which also introduces some issues that we can discuss later. So in that sense, we're looking at the treated on the treated difference in the sense that we're looking at a subgroup that were willing to be recontacted and actually answer the recontacted phone or email. In terms of the difference, well, in terms of visual cues, and this to better understand, the face-to-face questions, some of the questions had cards with alternatives, so some of them have visual cues, versus the telephone that none by definition. We have one question or a few questions with you have an either nor alternative. So you could ask whether you approve the government, I approve, do not approve, and the neither nor is not mentioned explicitly or not read. In the face-to-face and telephone, you can do that. The problem with the web survey is that we couldn't do that or capture well, so we included in the displayed with the other alternatives. In addition, the don't know, don't answer alternative, sorry, usually that is not read, not shown in the cards or read by the interviewer, but in the web survey, we have to choose a way to address the don't know, don't answer, and what we chose that, and it'd be great if we could discuss maybe later. If people, the don't know, don't answer alternative was not displayed in the initial question, but if people skip the question, the next question was the same question as before, but with the explicit alternative of don't know. So, and we'll discuss this later. And well, by definition, the interviewer was present on the phone or not. So we used 19 questions, which we group in 5 topics, and we excluded from the repeated questions those isolated or some that had explicit difference in the scale between modes, which was the left-right scale. In the telephone and in the face-to-face survey, people said, I do not identify freely, and we coded this as non-response, which is part of another discussion in terms of comparability of questionnaires behind. But in the web survey, we had an explicit does not identify alternative, so we do not include this in the analysis. And so what topics we included? We included evaluation of political figures. We included the 5 presidential candidates. It has 5 liker options with an additional does not know the person. We also included topics of perception of current situation, which is economic situation in the country and personal, and well as perception of Chile's progress. And then we also included a question on that address or that to capture political position, which is measuring income, a classic question of 2 poles between income being, if people prefer income being more equal versus not rewarded effort and vice versa, and government approval. And this is the question that I mentioned in which the neither nor alternative is explicitly included in the web, but not in the others. We also have a topic which is justification of violence, so better explained as a justification of use of force, either as a form of protest or by the police. Some of them are not actually forced, like evade payment in public transportation, but it's the use of some actions for protest and some actions by the police to contain the protest. And also we include questions regarding interest in politics. which the first is the usual battery of frequency of doing certain activities for informing them and interest in politics. And on this group of questions, we have both for the face-to-face and the web survey, we have visual cues, cards or displayed, and for the repetition on the phone, we did not have any card. So what are the results? I have, so this is the comparison. I have included the p-value on the comparison. As you see, well, some loss in translation. We only observe, only for the perception of the current situation, we observe differences in the non-response rate, which are statistically significant at the 5%. But if you do a Bonferroni correction, considering like we are comparing 5 group of items, topics, it's not significant. And in the telephone versus web, we find only 2 difference in response rates. So, but the difference is rather small. So it's 1.6 versus 0, 1.6 versus 0.3, which might be influenced by the form that people in the web survey need to answer twice a question if they want to do it non-response. But either way, what we find is that in general, we do not have a strong effect or substantive difference or systematic difference in terms of non-response between modes. So if we compare now non-differentiation, which is, we measure it as the variance in the battery or in the group of questions to measure straight lining. We do find some statistical differences, but I would love to hear your input in terms of how substantive these differences are. So we, for example, in interest in politics, we move from as larger variance in terms of in the telephone survey, but the difference is between 0.118 versus 0.139. So I would love to hear what would you consider, or where can we find what it means to be substantially different, not only statistically significantly different. So we do find that it's greater, the differentiation in TATI than in web survey versus, and it's systematic in both. So in telephone survey, it's always greater, the differentiation, than on the web or the face-to-face, except for the one group of questions that is more substantive. In terms of recency, which is the measures the proportion of last option selected, which is usually more common for the telephone, for the oral modes. We actually find the opposite on the only one that it's substantively different, and but we do find it greater in the telephone on one question on the other. So overall, our conclusions from this one is that we don't have systematic evidence of either a strong recency bias, and the same we observe in terms of the primacy, which is the proportion of the first alternative selected. We see in the justification of violence is greater among telephone, and it's substantively greater. But again, this may be influenced by the type of questions that we have. So if we look at the evaluation of political figures, which is also the same number scale, there's no substantive difference, and justification of violence is a scale that is a battery that in which never justificates its first. So it may be related to the results, the substantive results. So that's a question that we have, and it's the only one that we find a statistically significant difference between the face-to-face and the telephone. And on the other hand, we observe in different batteries or in different topics of questions, substantive differences, and we do see it on the CAWI, which is as we would expect it, and it's substantively greater, especially given that the survey, so those who have done surveys by the phone, it's very easy if you want to just skip that to just select the first alternative moving. So we expect the effect, and it's greater on this one. But then we observe the opposite effect on the other one. So it's, again, some mixed results. It's not very clear that we have overall. And now we look at measurement equivalence. In this, we follow the literature, Meredith, Tinkham, Matters, and Nat. We use a latent variable model, and we estimate 3 models, a configural model, which the only assumption is that it's the same structure across the group. So it's the same items are constitutive of the latent explained or are related to the latent variable. The metric model assumes or adds the restrictions that the loadings of each item must be equal across groups. And then the scalar model that assumes or restricts that in addition to the equal loadings, the intercept and thresholds should be equal across group. And what we do is evaluate whether the fit is statistically worse or not when adding the restrictions. For this, we scaled all variables and treat them as continuous. We tried to fit a more categorical model, it didn't converge, so we did have an issue. And we did some subject comparisons, so we do not weight. So basically, the example with the evaluation of political figures, this is the model that we fit. The configural model assumes the structure is equal across groups. Then the metric model assumes that each loading between both groups is similar, so the loading for each of the items is similar across group. And then the scalar model assumes that in addition, the intercepts are equal across groups. So what do we find? So overall, we find that systematic differences between the equivalence or the measurement equivalence between the face-to-face and telephone modes and between the telephone and web modes. For the face-to-face versus telephone mode, we found that metric equivalency holds for most questions except justification of violence, with metric and by definition scalar equivalence does not hold. But for interest in politics and perception of the current situation, both metric and scalar equivalence hold, which is encouraging. We find that for evaluation of political figures, we have metric equivalence, but we do not have a scalar equivalence. And for the justification of violence, we do not have neither metric nor scalar. And it's interesting because when we look at the measurement equivalence between the telephone mode and the web mode, which is the second part of the table, we find that the only one which is metric and scalar equivalent is the telephone and web. We wonder and we discuss that it may be through social desirability bias. And even though both face-to-face and telephone have the interviewer, the face-to-face people are not only in your presence and you can see their reactions, so you can feel their expected reactions, but you're in a more public setting perhaps than in the telephone, in which you do not see the person and it's more impersonal than the face-to-face. But it's only hypothesis by now. We evaluated the measurement equivalence by changes in the CFI and also by changes by the ANOVA test, the T-square. Within parentheses is, we did a Bonferroni correction because we're comparing 5 group of items, and within parentheses is the result without the Bonferroni correction, and it's usually statistically the p-value is really small, so it doesn't make a difference whether we do it or not. So, this is our main concern. So we analyze aggregate results. We First of all, we do not see statistically different results between mode if we look at the aggregate. We only see it between the telephone and the web on the current economic situation, which is puzzling because for the personal current economic situation and for the country current economic situation, the results are different, but the direction of change, whether they are more pessimistic or negative, is opposite between both questions. So we cannot find an explanation for that. And also we do find difference between use of force by the police and a form of protest. But again, if you assume social desirability, you would expect, for example, that people are more likely to justify use of force by the police and less likely to justify use of force by as a form of protest, or the other way around. And what we find, and these are the results, we have the distribution, but this gives you a view. This is the mean, if you consider it. So the smaller the number, the less justification or the less frequent you justify. So you justify more frequently the use of force by the police on the presence, on the face-to-face than on the, that on the telephone. But on the other way around, you justify less the participating looting on the other. So perhaps the social desirability actually is working in the same direction, but it's smallish. And then we have the biggest change we only observe in the person's economic situation, which is a really dramatic difference between results, aggregate results, in Kati versus Kawi. On every other question, the distribution of results is statistically identical. So we would get the same conclusions of our analysis on either mode. So the question now is, okay, but what happens regarding the differences between subjects? Do people change their answers between modes? We know that we have a median of 19 days between each wave. So there are some questions that are more likely to change between the days. We do not expect too great a change. The conditions, the political conditions did not experience such great changes between the timings, but there's also the questions. And we have some measurement error as well. So we're trying to better understand that. But we see that more than 30% of the subjects change their responses between waves. So what does that left us? So for example, in evaluation of political figures, we observe a greater change between waves from telephone to web. It's greater than from face-to-face to telephone, but again, it's around 30%, 40% of change. The same we observe in economic situation of the country, and the difference for some questions is much greater on the telephone to web versus the face-to-face, and we will address this later. And well, for the others questions we observe, but I wanted to give you a general sense that we have a substantive change between questions. But the last part that we're trying to address, okay, but what does this change mean? So we decomposed it in different categories. So we say, okay, we can observe change within categories. So say, for example, that you evaluate a political figure, a political candidate as very positive, and then you evaluate it as positive, or then positive and then very positive. It's just a change within category of intensity, but the substantive, the direction of your evaluation remains, so that we consider within categories. And the most worrisome change is between polar categories. So in one survey, I answered that I evaluate the presidential candidates very positively or positively, and then on the other, on the recontact, I evaluated negatively or very negative. Then we have all the combinations. I can move towards the intermediate category, so neither positive neither nor positive, and then I evaluated on one direction or the other way around. And I move from non-responding the question to responding to any position, or from non-response in any position to respond. So this is basically an exhaustive categorization of all the possible change. We consider the less worrisome the within categories change, and it could be, and the more worrisome the between polar categories. So in a positive sense, the blue so the blue section is those between polar categories. What we see is that although we observe a substantive change between surveys, between polar categories rather small, and within categories is usually the second to largest change. And then we have these, which are basically either from intermediately to taking a position or the other way around, or I change a response from non-response. And if you see an evaluation of political figure, there's a systematic, for every political figure, there's a similar distribution of the either change or not change, and the within and the composition of the change. So I need to erase this. We see this again. We observe a small percentage in all kind of questions regarding the polar categories, and which is in that sense more positive. But we do observe, which is the orange and brown changes from middle category to the polar categories. Sorry. So just to finish on mostly time, we have graphed the percentage of the respondents within that change from one survey to the other, from between polar categories. So we see that usually we have the percentage is higher between Capi and Cati than the other way around. And we see for the some association in terms of the number of alternatives that you could have, which makes sense. But what we wanted to address at the end is that although there seems some positive, and it depends on how you consider the percentage of changes in polar categories, that it seems it's not a substantive problem in terms of the percentage of people that changes between polar categories, between contact and recontact survey. People do change even in questions that should be less likely to change, which are education levels. So we are trying to see whether we could use this some proxy of measurement error, or some not measurement error, but how people change their answer from one another in a question that is highly factual from education level. But again, the percent of people that changes between polar categories is rather small on the reported education level. So in all, we don't have strong evidence on quality indicators, or at least not systematical evidence of changes. Measurement equivalence hold in more cases in the comparison between face-to-face and telephone survey than on the telephone and web. The difference may be due to social disability. And results, if we compare results, we would get the aggregates results are similar across modes, except some few changes, but substantive within subject changes, with the most worrisome category bordering between 5 and 15% of the subjects. So our challenge now is how to better distinguish this measurement from mode, which is not addressed in addition to the discussions of quality and measurement equivalence. So thank you, and looking forward to your comments, questions.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing your research. It's really interesting, thought-provoking, especially, thinking about what LAPOP does or did in the last round, like how we kind of manage these mode changes. So very relevant research. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask, either in the chat or you can raise your hand and ask it live? We do have one question from Clifford Sinnes. Did you do post-survey matching?
For this comparison, we did not, since it was within subject, so we have the same responses in both. But for the following, we are doing for comparison of, so for the coverage, we will compare the coverage, but for the analysis, we would like to. So a follow-up question on that, would you see that it would be an addition to this analysis to do post-survey, and how or why?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm confused about when you do comparisons between telephone, the telephone to face-to-face to telephone, and then telephone to web. How are those the same people? You randomized presumably, but you did within each group, you did comparison within subject, but didn't you also show results across comparing the two switches, which would not be the same person, as I understand it, and therefore require matching, at least, or might be suitable for matching. So I'm a little confused there.
Yeah, we have not yet compared, so I apologize if it was confusing. We only did the comparison between the contact and recontact sample, the within groups. So I compare the face-to-face and telephone respondents to the same group, and then the telephone respondents with the web survey. We have not yet compared different responses to the 12 different questions, and for that we will include post-survey. It's a very good idea to include post-survey matching in order to when we do the comparison of not the same group, not within subjects, but of the nationally representative telephone and face-to-face survey, or mixing between the telephone recontact and the telephone survey. Yeah, but we have not done that yet. We just have looked at the contact and recontact, which are the same people.
Thank you for the clarification. I missed some of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt Winters, do you want to go ahead?
Great. Thanks, Carmen, for this. Super interesting. I wanted to go back to the very first thing that you showed us about who said they were willing to be resurveyed and then who actually was willing to be resurveyed. I was so struck by the higher rate of saying, yes, you can resurvey me on the telephone relative to in person, right? Because you would expect the demand effect to go the other way around. It's easier to say no to somebody on the telephone, I don't want to do that, than somebody who's standing right in front of you. So I'm wondering what speculation you might have about that. And I guess going through my mind is the possibility that the people initially on the telephone survey were quite different from the people initially in the face-to-face survey.
Yeah, so our speculation is is on that lane. Systematically, we've seen that people that answer telephone surveys comparison with the face-to-face survey, I usually have are more educated on average, and they're more interested politically. So for example, in our sample face-to-face, like a third of the population, a third of the sample does not identify in the left-right scale. But on the RDD, about 12% does not identify in the left-right scale. So it's people more interested in politics and more educated. So it's more likely they'll be more interested in answering. And also, which is unobservable, but it's easier to say no to a telephone survey. So people who actually answer your survey have probably more disposition to answer you. So they will be more willing to answer your survey. But it's interesting that in terms of the follow-up, it's not as higher. So it's both. And also, and this is the telephone survey was shorter than the face-to-face. So we also may think, and this we cannot test it currently, that it was a fatigue effect on this one. But on the March, sorry if I'm speaking a bit confusing, but we did a similar exercise in March of that year that we have not yet analyzed because, well, we have to cut short our survey due to the pandemic. But that survey was shorter than the usual, so it was more similar in length. And again, we do find the telephone and face-to-face willingness to answer shorter. So on all, I think it's more on the selection bias of those who answer the telephone survey mostly. So in short sense, as you said, Matt.
Rebecca White-Shapiro.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carmen. This is super interesting. So I wonder if you could go back to and talk a little bit more about the inconsistency in reporting education levels and whether you looked at other factual questions. I found the rates of changing from polar categories in the other questions maybe reassuringly relatively small, but then when you get to a factual question, the same share of respondents is maybe troublingly large. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and whether you looked at other factual questions and what, if any, speculations you have as to what's happening with that, or with the factual questions in particular.
Yeah, okay, so in terms of this question, the education question, people were asked whether they were studying or not, and then the educational level, so whether they had completed or not, and it was a list of the educational level where they reached. And it's true, we do find some differences in this factual question that are quite worrisome. We look at difference, for example, in whether they had voted or not in the plebiscite, in the entry plebiscite. So in October 2020, so about 10 months prior to the survey, we have a big event, which was a plebiscite for whether we will draft or not a new constitution, which was kind of a salient event, like people. And we do find also that about 11% of those that answer the question change from yes to no. So it seems there's a probably percent of those that are changing their answers. We look whether assuming education is correct, and so we only look at those that give so we only look at contact the first sample education level. We do find some evidence or some indices that less educated people are more likely to change their responses, but it's still high. So it's encouraging that it's low in terms of 10%, but on the half empty glass, it's 10%. So our suspicions for now is that people, so measurement error, random error, people just, you're not capturing well what you want to capture, and and the troubling thing, and that's what we wanted to discuss and try to see and have ideas. But it's rather large, or it's higher than we had previously expected in terms of such factual things, and so we're stuck with that actually. And so any ideas, we're looking at education or interest in politics, but again, it's very it's everything measured by the same survey. So we have not looked at it, and now I'm discussing the cross, like those that change in one, how many changes they have, or polar. So for example, those that change in interest in voting the plebiscites are the same that change, and we could look at them better. So we probably will look at that, and I can tell during the then about it.
I mean, just to quickly follow up, I would say like voting in the plebiscite seems to me something where there might be, you know, obviously it's factual, but there might be some social desirability, or, you know, versus education, versus education, or if you ask about gender, or, you know, really factual questions, year of birth, or, you know, if you have children or something like that, you know, those are questions where we would hope to see the smallest possible change.
Yeah, well, you're right. That's true. Like a voter place. Unfortunately, we did not foresee, and that's a mistake. We did not, in order to shorten the recontact survey, we did not include, we only include this question of socioeconomic background variables. We did not include any other. So we do not have, which will be great, like what's your birth year, but that's an idea for the following. Hey, we can do that. Yeah, exactly. So we do not have another one that it's really like, you know yourself, you know how many, when you were born.
In the chat, Clifford said, might you also want to compare the changes observed with what statistically significant percent would switch if responses were randomly made?
That's, thanks, Clifford. That's a good idea to simulate and see if people just toss a coin for answering. Thanks. We will do.
I was wondering, so what was the reason for this particular setup with the mode change? Like why face-to-face to CADI and CADI to web, and not, for example, say CADI to, or CAPI to COWI, or some randomization of that? Was that just unrelated to the study, or was there a particular reason you made that?
Yeah. So we were more interested, at least from our perspective, on the CATI survey, which is has a better coverage. But we did want it, so on hindsight, I think we expected a low retake of the survey. So we were concerned of randomizing between those that answer, in terms that we would get like very little sample from the CAPI-CATI, which was our main interest. So that was the answer. And for the other one, I think that on hindsight, we should have randomized the CATI for CATI to web. We have many questions that we could have answered if we had the telephone to telephone contrast. So the reason for that, I think it's a bit of path dependency on our previous setup that the institution had, and we kind of follow. But for the face-to-face and telephone, it was a substantive interest because it would be more, if we ever moved, do the need to have representative samples, we need to move to telephone, and we were more interested in the parallel surveys of the face-to-face and telephone survey in terms of coverage and number of responses, and then on the mode. And the other was kind of an offshoot saying, okay, we have this, let's take advantage of this setup and do a web. But in hindsight, we should have randomized to telephone, the other one to have a comparison that would have been great. And yeah, so that's the honest answer about that.
Yeah, I think we all feel like that sometimes with after getting the results. We should have done X, Y, and Z, but are there any other questions? I was wondering if you could talk about just, do you have advice for practitioners? Like, is there some practical implication from this that you can tell, or is this still kind of in the exploration? Like, let's see what patterns we can find. And
In terms of mode, we're still struggling in terms of measurement error and try to address them better. The results in terms of quality indicators seems that they go well, but we're very concerned about this intra-subject change, especially if you want to do panel studies or so. We have not any advice on that because we're trying to figure out, and we would love to have some advice from you. But in terms of practitioners, I think the main drawback of the face-to-face survey is the time frame and the cost. And so a telephone survey, I think it would work well as long as you recognize that you're omitting a substantive portion of the population, not substantive, but a portion of the population that is not as interested in politics. And I don't think that is it depends on your question. So for example, usually in Chile at least, or before the voting was voluntary, so the selection bias of telephone survey was much more similar to selection bias of voting. So you could get like perhaps more accurate results in terms of participation that are face-to-face since the modes of voting participation. So I think it depends. But I think that we have to acknowledge that the telephone and the face-to-face survey are substantively different in terms of interest in politics and things like that. If you care about that, you should at least acknowledge it. I don't know. And we're still on early stages for the web. People have I think it's a similar problem that we face worldwide. I don't think it's special to the case. And there was a recently big report about that, isn't it, on probability and non-probability samples, but this is different.
Thanks. Clifford, do you want to go?
I don't want to monopolize, but if nobody else is asking questions, then why would I look a free question in the mouth, so to speak? What about, I mean, there are other, I've done a lot. I've done some work on playing around with these modal issues, and I'm wondering, what if you also you could ask people whether they would take the same type of survey again, as opposed to
yeah, that's a really, we did ask, and we haven't looked at it. We did ask whether we asked for the telephone and the email, and then we asked whether they would be willing to ask a survey and whether they would, since the face-to-face, maybe we could have done it on hindsight, since the face-to-face was never an option for us because it's impossible to do a recontact on face-to-face. We only asked, but we asked for the preferred way. So that would, to try to address that. So maybe we could look at that, which is not exactly the same question, but see whether those who prefer to be contacted by phone are different than those who prefer to be contacted by email.
And yeah, I mean, and the other, I mean, yeah, I think that's a low-hanging fruit if you're going to do a future design there. I mean, just give them the same one, that way you can isolate. There was one other question I had in this regard, but I am now it's slipped my mind, so I'll just stop there. But thank you very much. This is I think I know what it was. Yeah, in our design, what we did is when somebody didn't want to take a mode, we asked them. We did two things. When they signed up for a mode, we then asked them, "Oh, would you mind switching to this other mode? We can't do that mode," So they agree to the telephone, and we say, "Oh, gee, we need you to come in, or we need to meet you face to face," and so that's a design tweak that you may find might be interesting to tease out some of this stuff. I'll just leave you that. You don't have to respond if you don't want to.
But so you ask them their preferred mode of collection, and then when you recontacted them by the other, one?
No.
In the same survey, you say, what's your preferred mode and say, oh, okay, that mode, we cannot do it. We will recontact you by this mode?
No, we assigned modes randomly. And then, for example, somebody came in, you know, they were face to face. So we contacted them and said, you know, we have a problem. The numerator can't, whatever. Can we do it by phone?
Okay. So
in other words, what we understand is that there are two issues here. One is agreeing to be part of it. And the other is what mode you agree to be part of. So that was part of the thing we were interested in. You can get somebody who in principle would agree to some, you know, and then there is agreeing and then actually showing up and taking the thing. So there are these different slides. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize this any further.
No, but let me just follow up with a question. When we ask them to follow up, we will say, would you be willing to participate in a new survey? We have not thought, or I have not thought, that people naturally assume that it would not specify the mode of the survey when we ask them, but people would assume that it would be the same mode.
Is that what you did, or are you asking whether that's what we did?
No, I was asking if you do not if you don't specify the mode to the people when you ask them to participate, and it makes sense actually. They would assume that it's the same mode. And you said we will contact you later by any of these different modes.
I mean, in our case, we assigned a mode, and then when they responded, we asked them if we could switch. I mean, we didn't ask them, we told them we needed to switch. But what you're saying and what we're saying is there are a lot of nice little design variations that one could think of once one starts thinking about these things. You know, once you have the idea that you could change the mode on someone, you know, that it presents a lot of interesting variations that you know, I'm sure I've missed half of. But anyway, I wanted to just put that bee in your bonnet.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. That's yeah, that's another thing that we consider. We try to address mode preferences by asking them, and then not, well, it's maybe not very, but not considering them, but the preference. And then we will want to look whether people that said they prefer one are, that's another thing that you said. I know, I understand, but thanks a lot. It's an additional, we should consider it.
All right, well, we're at the hour, so everybody please join me in thanking Dr. Le Foulon for sharing your research. I hope we get to see it in print very soon. So yeah, we'll continue the WISM next month, as Carmen mentioned, with Alex Renat. So please join us for that. Thanks.
Thanks to you and to everyone for coming and for all the questions and comments. I really appreciate it. Very helpful.
Let's do. Thanks.